The girl, Annie, had heard horses before, but this one moved slow, like it carried something heavy that wasn't just a man. The fog parted just enough to show him. A tall stranger on a gray mare, his coat dark with dew, his hat pulled low. He didn't call out, didn't make a show of his arrival. He only stopped a few paces away, looked down at the girl, and waited. His face was carved in quiet, the kind of stillness that comes from years of losing more than words could explain. Annie's breath clouded the air as she whispered, "Are you here to hurt our mama too? She's dying." The words seemed to echo through the fog like a bell. The man dismounted, the leather reins creaking. He crouched to her height, his boots sinking into the soft mud. For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a voice low as the creek's murmur, he answered, "No, little one. I'm here to help." But the girl didn't move. She watched him with the wide, mistrusting eyes of a child who'd seen kindness turn cruel before. Her lip trembled. Behind her, the door hung half open, revealing a faint glow of firelight and the ragged cough of a woman fighting for breath. The man, Jonas Reed, glanced past the girl and saw the truth of her words. He stepped closer. Annie backed up, clutching the hem of her nightdress like a shield. "Stay there," she whispered. "She don't like strangers no more." Jonas paused, his silhouette ghost-like in the haze. He had come because Widow Agnes from town had told him of a family near dying. Said a woman and her girl had been left to fend for themselves after bandits took the husband and the winter took the crops. Jonas hadn't planned to stop. He told himself he'd drop off flour and move on. But something about the way Agnes had said, "The little one still talks to her mama even when she faints," had kept him awake for nights. So he rode out this morning, following the fog like it might lead him to something worth saving. "I'll just leave these by the door," he said, setting a small burlap sack and a canteen at the step. Annie's eyes darted from the supplies to his face. He looked strange to her, unkempt beard, strong hands, a scar above his brow, but his voice carried no sharpness. She stepped aside as if deciding to let him pass through a gate she didn't own. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, sweat, and crushed herbs. A kettle hissed over low flames. On a straw mattress lay her mother, Laura May, her hair damp against her temples, her skin the color of paper left in the rain. Jonas knelt beside her. She stirred but didn't wake. Her breath rattled. Annie watched from the corner, half hiding behind a chair, her fingers tight around a chipped cup. Jonas dipped a cloth in cool water and wiped the woman's brow. "Fever's been here a while," he murmured. Annie nodded, almost proudly, as if she'd been fighting it too. "I've been giving her the leaves Miss Agnes told us about, but they don't work no more." He looked around. The small table was cluttered with dried herbs, old bread, and the broken handle of a kettle. Through the cracked window, fog seeped in like it wanted to listen. He straightened, his back brushing the rafters, and gently fed the fire. Laura's lips moved. Her voice was faint, words half swallowed by air. "Who's there?" Jonas turned, tipping his hat respectfully. "Name's Jonas Reed, ma'am. Came from up by the ridge. Heard you might need a hand." Her eyes opened, gray and glassy. She studied him the way a wounded animal studies a trap. "We don't take charity," she whispered. "Wasn't offering it," he said softly. "Just wood, food, and quiet." For a moment, she almost smiled, but the effort cost her. She closed her eyes again, and a single tear slipped toward her ear. Annie hurried over and wiped it away, whispering that everything would be all right. The girl's words were brave lies, and Jonas could hear it. He stayed until the sun pushed faint gold into the fog. When he finally stepped outside, the world felt smaller, quieter. His mare waited patiently, steam rising from her nostrils. Jonas looked back at the cabin, the sagging roof, the tired walls, the small child peeking from the doorway like a lantern flickering against night. Something inside him twisted, that old ache he never talked about, the loss of his own kin, buried 2 winters past when sickness swept through the valley. He mounted up and rode off slow, letting the fog swallow him again. But before he reached the ridge, he heard a faint voice calling after him. "Annie's. Will you come back?" He didn't answer. Not then. But when he reached his barn, He found himself unloading an extra sack of oats, a small tin of honey, and the only clean blanket he owned. He muttered to no one, "Just till she's well." By dusk he was back at their door. The fog had thickened again, swirling like memory. Annie's eyes widened when she saw him. "I told Mama you'd come back," she said, half grinning, half afraid. He placed the blanket over Laura's bed and handed the honey to the girl. "For the cough," he said. "A spoon a day." As the fire crackled, Laura woke briefly. She saw the man again and frowned weakly. Why you doing this?" He looked at her hands, thin, trembling, still trying to hold on. "Because someone should have," he said simply. Outside, a crow called from a pine, and the fog began to thin as if the land itself wanted to breathe again. Annie sat by the hearth, humming softly. Jonas watched her, then turned toward the window. He could already feel the town's eyes on him, though none were there. Helping a widow, even dying, was a kind of talk men avoided. But he stayed anyway. That night, when the fire burned low, Laura stirred again. Her fever had eased. She whispered to her daughter, thinking Jonas couldn't hear. "Maybe, not all men come to hurt us." Jonas, sitting in the corner with his hat in his hands, caught the words like a prayer drifting through the smoke. He looked toward them, mother and child framed in that fragile light, and for the first time in years, something within him shifted. He wasn't sure what it was. Mercy, maybe. Or the ghost of his own lost family breathing through the fog. Whatever it was, he knew he'd come back again. Outside, the dawn began to stir behind the hills, and a new wind pushed through the mist. The sound of it against the pines was almost like a voice, soft, forgiving, calling him home. He stood in the doorway, looking once more at the sleeping woman and the child curled beside her. Then, as the fog thinned to silver, he whispered into the waking day, "Rest easy. I'll be back before the sun's warm." And somewhere deep inside the cabin, though neither mother nor child stirred, the fire brightened, its glow steady, like a promise that refused to fade. The mornings came slow after that, gray light spreading through the valley like the smoke of a dying fire. Spring still felt shy. Mist clung to the ground, and the damp wood around the cabin never seemed to dry. Jonas returned each day before the sun had fully burned the fog away, his horse breathing steam into the cold air, his saddle creaking softly as he dismounted. He never knocked. Annie always seemed to sense him before he reached the door, as if the child had learned to listen for mercy. Inside, Laura was stronger now, though her body still moved as if she carried winter in her bones. Her cheeks had gained a hint of color, and her voice, though frail, could scold again. That morning, she tried to rise before Jonas arrived, insisting she could make breakfast herself. But when she reached for the kettle, her legs gave way. Jonas caught her before she hit the floor. "I told you I can manage," she murmured, embarrassed by the strength in his arms. "I know," he said. "But let me anyway." There was no judgment in his tone, only quiet patience. He set her gently back on the chair, then filled the pot with water from the bucket. Annie stood on her toes beside him, proud to show she'd already gathered kindling. The fire took slow, its orange glow flickering across their faces. Laura watched them both, the man who spoke little and the girl who spoke too much, realizing the cabin no longer felt like a grave. Jonas worked without asking what needed doing. He patched the roof where rain had seeped through, tightened the window hinges, swept the ashes. His hands were large and rough, scarred from years of labor, yet every movement carried a kind of gentleness. Even when he hammered a nail, he seemed aware of every sound, every breath inside the room. By the second week, Annie had followed him everywhere. She shadowed him out to the small pasture where his horse grazed, asking endless questions. "Do horses get lonely? Do you talk to the moon when no one's around?" He never told her to be quiet. He just smiled, that faint curve that barely reached his eyes, and let her chatter fill the silence that had ruled his days too long. Laura often watched from the window. It stirred something sharp and tender inside her, the sight of her daughter laughing again. But it also frightened her. Every kindness came with a cost in her memory, and she had paid too many. One afternoon, while Jonas repaired the door hinge, Laura spoke, her tone cautious but steady. "You shouldn't trouble yourself so much. Folks in town will wonder why a man spends his days fixing a widow's cabin." Jonas didn't look up. "They can wonder." She hesitated. "It isn't right. I can't repay you." He set down the hinge and met her eyes for the first time that day. "I didn't ask for payment." The silence that followed was heavier than words. Outside, the fog was thinning, sunlight sliding through the trees like gold dust. He returned to his work, but his movements slowed, thoughtful. She wanted to say more, to tell him that gratitude and fear sometimes shared the same breath, but she couldn't find the courage. That evening, as the light dimmed, the wind carried the faint scent of rain. Laura tried again to cook. Jonas sat by the hearth, mending his gloves. Annie hummed beside her mother, stacking tin plates. Laura poured stew into a bowl, her hand shaking slightly. When she handed it to him, she said, "It's not much." He took it with quiet grace. "It's more than I had yesterday." The words unsettled her. "Don't you have anyone waiting for you?" Jonas looked at the fire. "Used to. Not anymore." That was all he said, but it was enough. His voice had the sound of someone who had stopped expecting warmth. She wanted to ask what had happened, but the look in his eyes, steady, distant, like the horizon after rain, told her not to. Later that night, after Jonas left, Laura found a bundle by the door. 2 small sacks of flour, a bar of soap, and a folded note with no words, only a pressed wildflower between the pages of an old Bible leaf. She traced the fragile petals with her finger. No man had given her something so delicate since her husband's courting days. She placed it beside her bed, unable to sleep for the ache it stirred. The days followed a rhythm after that. Jonas brought fresh milk. Laura baked small loaves of bread in thanks. He mended her fence. She mended his torn sleeve. The quiet between them became its own language, one of shared breaths, gentle nods, and half-finished sentences. But not everyone approved. Widow Agnes came by one morning, her voice brisk as frost. "Laura May, people are talking. They say you've found yourself a savior, that you're keeping him fed so he'll stay." Laura flushed. "He's just helping." "Help like that don't stay quiet long," Agnes said, leaning close. "Men like him don't do favors without reason." When Jonas returned later with a bucket of nails, Laura met him at the door, her expression guarded. "You shouldn't come tomorrow." He frowned slightly. "Something wrong. People are starting to talk." Her voice trembled. "I can't have them say things around my girl." He didn't argue. He only nodded, his jaw tight. "If that's what you want." "It's what's right," she said, though her eyes betrayed her. He left without another word. The sound of his horse fading into the fog was like a door closing on her heart. Annie cried that night, asking why he wasn't coming back. Laura couldn't answer. She only held her child close and stared at the window where the lantern's reflection trembled in the glass. 3 days passed. The fog thickened again, the air heavy with spring rain. Laura grew weaker, her fever returning without warning. She tried to fetch water herself and nearly collapsed by the well. Annie screamed for help, her voice carrying through the valley like a desperate prayer. By the time she opened her eyes again, Jonas was there, soaked through from the rain, his hands already lifting her from the mud. She tried to push him away, weakly protesting, but he didn't let go. "Don't talk," he said quietly. "You're burning up." He carried her inside, set her by the fire, and wrapped her in blankets. Annie clung to his coat, sobbing into the wet fabric. Jonas tended to the fever with the same calm he'd used to mend fences. He didn't ask permission. He only worked until her breathing steadied. When she finally looked up at him through half-open eyes, she whispered, "Why'd you come back?" He met her gaze with that same quiet steadiness. "Because you never told me not to care." Her lips parted, but no words came. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire snapped and filled the room with warmth. For a moment, the cabin felt like a place the world had forgotten, a pocket of peace that existed only for the living and the lost. Jonas sat beside her bed as the hours passed, his eyes never leaving her face. He had seen death before. He would not let it take her if he could help it. Laura, drifting between sleep and waking, thought she heard him whisper, not a prayer, but something like it. When dawn broke, pale light spilling through the cracks, her fever had broken. The fog outside glowed faintly pink. Jonas stood by the door, his coat still damp, ready to leave again. Laura's voice was hoarse. "You can't stay here, Jonas. People will think." He turned, his expression unreadable. "Let them." Annie stirred awake, rubbing her eyes. "Mama," she said softly, "he came back even when you said not to." Laura looked from her daughter to the man standing in the doorway. The fog behind him framed him like a memory, like something both fragile and inevitable. Her heart stuttered as she realized what frightened her most wasn't the gossip, or the sickness, or even the loneliness. It was how safe she felt when he was near. Jonas tipped his hat slightly, eyes lingering on her face. "I'll be back when the roof stops leaking," he said. She almost told him not to, almost, but the words dissolved on her tongue. He stepped into the fog again, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the soft hush of rain. For a long time, she sat there, watching the doorway as if expecting him to reappear. Then, without thinking, she reached for the Bible leaf beside her bed, the one with a wildflower pressed inside, and closed it carefully against her heart. By late spring, the valley had turned green again. Wildflowers spread along the fences, and the creek that once froze in silence now whispered softly through the grass. But for all the beauty returning to the land, the air carried another kind of heaviness, the kind that wasn't weather but whisper. It began in town, as all things cruel do, with a name said one too many times in the wrong company. Laura had not stepped beyond the cabin for weeks, yet she could feel the shift before the words ever reached her. Jonas came each morning, same as before, fixing, hauling, mending. He brought small things, a pail of milk, a hammer, a story about a fox he'd seen near the ridge, to fill the quiet. Annie, always watching, had begun to call him Mr. Jonas, with the kind of devotion that children save for those who've earned their trust. But even innocence can't keep out the world's voice forever. It was Widow Agnes who carried it first, though not with malice. She arrived one bright morning, her apron dusted with flour, her eyes restless. "Laura May," she said, setting a loaf on the table, "you know I mean well, but tongues are wagging in town. They're saying you found yourself a man under that fog." Laura froze, her hands tightening around the edge of the counter. "He's been helping with repairs. Nothing more." Agnes sighed. "You don't have to explain to me. But folks don't see what's in your heart. They see what they want to see. And a widow with a man visiting daily. Well, that's fuel for a long winter of talk." Laura turned her gaze toward the window, where Jonas was splitting wood, each swing steady as breath. "He saved my life," she whispered. "And my child's." "I know," Agnes said softly, "but kindness don't protect a woman's name. Be careful. People remember sin longer than salvation." When she left, Laura stood still for a long time, the room thick with the sound of the axe outside. She didn't tell Jonas what Agnes had said. She didn't need to. The way his shoulders tensed when he caught her watching told her he already knew. That night, the town's judgment came closer. 2 riders passed by the cabin near dusk, their voices low but sharp enough to pierce the quiet. "That's the place," one said. "The widow and her rancher friend. Heard he ain't been to church since she came around." The other chuckled. "Must have found a different kind of religion." Jonas heard it from inside. His jaw tightened. He didn't go to the door. He simply kept mending the chair leg in his hands until the wood stopped shaking. Laura watched him from across the room, her heart splitting between gratitude and shame. The next morning, she told him not to come anymore. "It isn't right," she said, standing in the doorway with her hair unbraided, her voice trembling. "You've done enough." He stared at her, confused at first, then wounded. "You think I care what they say?" "It isn't about you," she said. "It's about Annie. I won't have her grow up hearing that her mama drove a man to ruin." He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and looked at her for a long, silent moment. "You think helping you's ruin?" "I think mercy always costs someone something," she whispered. He nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a sentence. "If that's what you need." She turned away so he wouldn't see her tears. When she looked back, he was already walking toward the fog, his figure fading into the silver veil that had once brought him to her door. Days passed. The cabin fell quiet again. The repairs Jonas had made held strong, but the silence cracked something deeper. Annie stopped humming. She sat by the window each morning, her small hands pressed to the glass. "He's comin' back," she'd say. But the road stayed empty. Laura tried to fill the hours with work, washing, mending, baking, but the air felt thinner without him. The fire burned dull. At night, she caught herself reaching for the Bible leaf he'd left her, the pressed wildflower now faded to the color of ash. She held it like proof that kindness had been real once, even if it couldn't last. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the ridge, heavy with spring thunder. Laura was bringing water from the well when a pain cut through her chest. Her knees buckled, the bucket slipping from her grasp. She tried to call for Annie, but her voice came out as a whisper swallowed by the wind. She fell against the wet grass, her breath shallow. Annie ran out, screaming for help into the storm. Her small voice carried through the valley, thin and wild. For a moment, it felt like no one would answer. Then, through the curtain of rain, came the sound of hooves, fast, urgent, familiar. Jonas rode hard through the storm, rain slashing across his face. When he saw Laura lying in the mud, something inside him broke. He was off the horse before it stopped, kneeling beside her, his hands shaking as he lifted her head. "You shouldn't be here," she gasped. He ignored her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Don't talk. I've got you." Annie clung to his leg, crying. "She can't breathe, Mr. Jonas." He carried Laura inside, his boots leaving muddy prints across the floor. He laid her on the bed, stoked the fire, and pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. The fever had returned, fiercer this time. He mixed herbs, whispered steady words, and waited through the long, trembling hours while the storm raged outside. When the thunder finally faded, Laura's breathing evened. She opened her eyes, weak but alive. Jonas sat beside her, his face pale with exhaustion. She stared at him for a long time, then whispered, "Why'd you come?" He looked down, his voice rough. "Because you didn't tell me not to care." Tears burned her eyes. "They'll talk even worse now." "Let him," he said quietly. "They've already decided who we are. Might as well give 'em something worth talking about." She tried to laugh, but it came out as a sob. Annie crawled up onto the bed, curling beside her mother. Jonas reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Laura's face, his touch so careful it hurt. Outside, the fog began to lift. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. For the first time since her husband's death, Laura felt the smallest seed of peace, fragile but alive. The next morning, when Jonas prepared to leave, Laura stood in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl. "You'll be back?" she asked. He met her gaze. "If you'll have me." She hesitated, then nodded. Annie would like that. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds both promise and restraint. "Then I'll bring her something next time. Maybe a colt to raise." She wanted to tell him to be careful, to stay away until the gossip cooled, but the words refused to form. She watched him mount his horse, watched the fog swallow him again. When she turned back, Annie was watching her with wide, knowing eyes. "Mama," she said softly, "you looked happy when he was here." Laura knelt and pulled her daughter close. "Sometimes happiness makes trouble, Annie." The child tilted her head. "Then maybe trouble's not always bad." Laura didn't answer. She only kissed her daughter's hair and held her close until the smell of rain faded from their clothes. That night, the sound of frogs rose from the creek. The world outside seemed to have forgotten its judgment for a while. Laura sat by the window, candlelight flickering on her face. She thought of the man who'd ridden through the storm for her, of the warmth in his hands, the quiet in his eyes. She wondered if mercy was ever meant to stay secret. When she finally blew out the candle, the room fell into gentle darkness. Somewhere far off, she heard the distant echo of a horse's hooves and thought she saw a shape moving along the ridge. Tall, steady, watching. She couldn't tell if it was real or memory. But her heart, still bruised from years of loss, whispered its own truth. Not all storms come to destroy. Some come to carry the lost home. The days that followed were gentler than anyone could have expected. The storms had passed, and the world seemed to exhale. The valley stretched wide and green under a patient sky, and the creek beside the cabin murmured like a forgiving soul. Spring had fully arrived, and with it came the slow, careful return of color, in the grass, in the air, in Laura's cheeks. Jonas still came each morning, though less from duty now and more from something quieter, harder to name. He'd tie his horse by the fence and knock once out of habit, though Annie always heard him before he reached the door. She'd run out barefoot, her braids bouncing, shouting that breakfast was almost ready. He never corrected her when she called it our breakfast, though a part of him still hesitated at the word. Laura walked without trembling now, her steps steady though light. Her illness had loosened its hold, but a deeper ache remained, not in her body, but somewhere behind her ribs. Gratitude and guilt often live side by side, and she felt both with every glance toward Jonas. He worked around the cabin as though he belonged to the land itself, mending the fence line, tending the garden, and fixing the porch rail where her husband's boot had once split the wood. He didn't speak much while he worked, but silence around Jonas had stopped feeling empty. It had begun to feel like trust. One morning, Laura stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee, black, bitter, but hot. The steam rose between them as she handed him one. Her fingers brushed his, and something inside her caught. She pulled back too quickly, spilling a few drops on her apron. He pretended not to notice, only said, "That'll keep the chill off you." She nodded, smiling faintly. "You've done too much already." He looked toward the distant ridge, where fog still clung to the trees. "Not enough, I think." Annie chased a butterfly nearby, laughing. The sound lifted something in him. He hadn't heard laughter in his home since the war had taken his brother and his brother's wife, leaving him with silence so deep it felt like another kind of death. But here, under the soft sun, with that small girl spinning through wildflowers, he could almost believe life forgave what time broke. Word of Jonas's visits still stirred in town, though the rumors had grown stale. Folks always tire of gossip when kindness keeps winning. Some had even begun to say maybe the man was just being decent after all. Still, a few tongues wagged, and it was that unease that lingered between Laura and Jonas like a faint, invisible mist. One afternoon, Jonas offered to take Laura and Annie into town. He said the horse needed new shoes, and Annie needed a ribbon for her hair. Laura hesitated. "I haven't been to town since the funeral," she murmured. "Then maybe it's time," he said softly. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his eyes for something she couldn't name. Then she nodded. The ride was quiet, the air sweet with blooming sage. Annie sat in front, holding the reins with small, confident hands, while Jonas steadied her from behind. Laura sat side saddle, her shawl fluttering in the wind. The sun touched everything, the horses, the hills, even the scar on Jonas's brow that caught the light like a silver thread. When they reached town, conversation stopped as they passed. Heads turned, whispers followed. Jonas dismounted first and helped Laura down. She tried to hide her trembling hands. At the general store, silence thickened. The shopkeeper's wife offered a tight smile. "Morning, Mrs. May," she said, her voice polite but cold. Laura lifted her chin, her voice clear though soft. "Good morning. I'll take a sack of flour and some sugar, please." Jonas stood beside her, unmoved by the stares. When the coins slipped from Laura's shaking hand, he caught them before they hit the counter, set them down gently, and said, "Add a spool of red ribbon, too." The woman hesitated, then nodded. Annie beamed. When they stepped outside, Laura exhaled, her body trembling as though she'd been holding her breath for years. "I thought I'd forgotten how to stand up straight in that place," she whispered. Jonas handed her the ribbon. "You didn't forget. You just needed reminding." Something inside her softened at his words. She hadn't realized how small she'd allowed herself to become. That day, under the open sky, She began to take back a part of her dignity she thought was gone for good. They returned to the cabin before sunset. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. Annie fell asleep in Jonas's arms on the ride home, her head resting against his chest. Laura watched them from her side of the saddle, her heart torn between wonder and fear. She'd lost everything once before. The thought of feeling again, only to lose, terrified her more than sickness ever had. That night, after Jonas had left, Laura sat by the fire, the ribbon folded neatly in her lap. She realized she was no longer afraid of the world's judgment, only her own. The next morning, the sun rose golden and warm, and the fog was thinner than it had been all spring. Jonas arrived early, carrying a small wooden box. "Something I thought you and Annie might like," he said. Inside were seedlings, tomato, squash, and one he'd labeled sunflower, though his handwriting wavered. Laura ran her fingers over the seeds, her throat tightening. "You're planting roots you might not want to keep," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "I've been rootless long enough." The words hung between them like smoke. Neither spoke for a while. Annie ran to fetch a spade, shouting that she'd dig first. Jonas smiled and followed, his long shadow stretching beside hers. By midday, the garden was half planted. Laura knelt in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, sunlight warming her neck. Jonas worked beside her, sweat glistening on his forearms, the scent of turned soil and wild mint between them. When their hands brushed over the same patch of earth, she didn't pull away this time. They finished just as the light began to fade. Laura stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. Jonas looked at her and said softly, "You belong here more than the flowers ever will." She laughed, a quiet, startled sound. "You talk like you're reading from a book that hasn't been written yet." He looked at her, serious. "Maybe I'm waiting for you to write it." That night, the stars came out bright as lanterns. Laura lay awake long after Annie slept. The air carried the faint scent of pine smoke and tilled soil. She thought of Jonas, of his hands, his silence, his stubborn kindness. The ache in her chest was no longer pain. It was longing. The next morning brought visitors. 2 men from town, faces grim, voices rehearsed. They said Jonas's help had become a concern for propriety. One even suggested she ought to marry him if she meant to keep his company. Laura's face flushed with shame and anger. "You think decency needs a contract to breathe," she said sharply. Jonas, who'd been by the barn, heard the last of it. He walked over, wiping his hands. "If it's peace you're after, I'll leave." Laura's heart jolted. "That's not what I want." The men shifted awkwardly, murmuring apologies before retreating down the path. When they were gone, the valley was quiet again except for the wind through the willows. Jonas turned to her. "You don't owe me anything, Laura. Not your defense, not your reputation. If my being here hurts you—" "It doesn't," she interrupted. "It hurts when you're gone." He froze, her words cutting clean through the air. She stepped closer, her breath trembling. "You walked through a storm to save me. You stayed when I pushed you away. And I don't know how to thank someone who brought me back to life." "You don't," he said softly. "Just live." She reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched his face. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starved of sunlight. At that moment, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the garden they'd planted together. A single sunflower seed, still loose on the porch, rolled toward them and caught in the hem of her dress. He smiled faintly. "Seems the earth's got plans for us." Weeks passed, and the garden bloomed. The town grew quiet, losing interest in old gossip. Jonas began building a small addition to the cabin, not because she asked, but because he wanted to give her space enough for peace. Each nail he drove seemed to echo something unspoken between them. One evening, near sunset, he stood at the half-built doorway, hat in hand. "Laura," he said quietly, "I'll be heading back to my ranch after this is done. You and Annie won't need me much longer." The words fell like stones into still water. Laura looked up from the table, her face pale in the golden light. "You think what I need is fixing fences and hauling water?" He swallowed hard. It's what I know how to give. She stepped closer, her eyes fierce through the quiet. Then give me the truth, Jonas Reed. Are you leaving because of them, or because you're afraid to stay? The silence stretched. He set his hat down slowly, his breath uneven. Because if I stay, I won't ever leave again. Her voice softened. Then maybe that's the point. He stood there for a long moment, the light between them shifting from gold to amber to dusk. Finally, he reached for her hand, his rough fingers closing gently over hers. You sure? He whispered. Laura nodded once, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. I'm tired of living half a life. Jonas drew her close, the scent of her hair mingling with smoke and rain. He kissed her, not like a man claiming, but like one coming home. Outside, the wind bent the tall grass, and the creek whispered its quiet approval. When they parted, Annie's sleepy voice came from the doorway. Mama, are we a family now? Laura smiled through her tears, resting her head against Jonas's chest. We've been one for a while, sweetheart. The world's just catching up. Jonas laughed softly, his hand resting over Laura's. The fire crackled, throwing warm light across the room. Outside, the garden swayed, the first sunflower opening toward the night. Sometimes mercy doesn't arrive with thunder or words. Sometimes it walks through fog, carrying a bucket of water and a quiet heart, and builds a home where the world expected ruin. And for the first time in years, as the stars rose above the ridge, Laura May whispered a prayer not for survival, but for gratitude.